Hi there, welcome to DIY Comics FAQ. I'm GE Gallas and I'm here to answer your questions about indie comics, graphic novels, webcomics, zines, self-publishing, storytelling, you name it. If you like my channel, don't forget to subscribe. So this episode is a continuation of answering Joanna Becker at Joanna Makes Art on Twitter. I've done two previous videos, one about kind of how to think about script writing for your comic or graphic novel, and one about outlining to prepare for writing a script for your graphic novel. So this video I'm going to be talking about thumbnails, how to turn your script into thumbnails. So let me refresh your memory of the question. The question is, when outlining a story that has a lot of different things going on, how do you approach thumbnailing it into comic pages without making it a 12-book series? I have a huge idea, but I'm getting stuck with how many pages plot points need to be without overloading the reader. So this episode, I'm going to be showing you specific examples from my graphic novel projects of what the script looks like and how I drew my thumbnails based on my script, how I transferred my script into thumbnails. And the thumbnails are a map or a plan as to how the final comic book pages are going to look. So thumbnailing is a really important step for a lot of people. It's certainly an important step for me because then I don't have to worry about planning out each page as I go through the final comic book pages. I already have a plan as to what those pages are going to look like. Let's start with Pawn My Soul, since it's in some ways my most simple graphic novel project. I've discussed this before, where every page is a single panel, so it's a lot less complex than graphic novels and comics that have multiple panels per page. So here we're looking at the script. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so we can see it better. So here we go. So this is the very beginning of the script. So let me go through we're going to go through the first scene, and then I'll show you how the thumbnails and the finished pages. So the very first line is just Lilith's house, really simple. I really guess I don't put that much detail into my scripts because I already kind of have an idea in my head of what that's going to look like. So it's really just a note as to what goes where. So Lilith's house, next to the house, a small graveyard. Lilith sits in front of her parents' grave. Lilith, mother, father, where are you now? A rotten tomato is thrown. The tomato hits Lilith. She is surprised. Young boy, wretch. Another boy, demon. A third boy, witch. They throw stones at Lilith. She raises her arms to protect herself. The boys leave her. Lilith weeps. So as you can see, I have written numbers next to each of these lines. These are notes as to what I wanted to take place on each page. So I first just wrote the script, not really thinking about how I was going to divide them up into pages and panels. But then when I was preparing to do thumbnails, I went back and wrote these notes, these numbers, to figure out how I wanted to divide everything up. So let me show you the thumbnails now. Here are the first thumbnails for Pawn My Soul. So you can see Lilith's house, that's page 1. And then next to the house, a small graveyard. So that's what page 2 is. And Lilith sits in front of her parents' grave. I kind of added another page to just introduce Lilith, what she looks like, and her facial expression to tell the audience what her mood was. And so then page 4 is Lilith sitting in front of her parents' grave. Page 5 is the tomato being thrown, so you just see one hand. You don't really know necessarily who threw the tomato. and then the tomato landing on Lilith, and her hands are raised to try to dodge the tomato. So as you can tell by these thumbnails, they're very simply drawn. I didn't spend that much time on drawing these each individually. I mean, it takes a long time to sit and draw 100 pages worth of thumbnails, but it really, for each one, it maybe took me like no more than 5 minutes, I would say, tops, to draw each image. So it's really just an idea, a gesture, you know, it's just how the figures are going to look on each page. So not just what's going on in one page, the subject of each page, but, you know, the movement that's going on, how the negative space and the positive space is going to work. I think a lot about positive and negative space. So positive space is the subject of the thumbnail or the picture, the illustration. So for instance, in number 6, the subject is Lilith. And then the negative space is all of this background around her. So I think a lot about how her not just how her figure is going to look, but what shape is going to be created in the negative space outside of her figure. So, okay, now let me show you the final pages. So here's my Pawn My Soul zine. This is volume 1. So you can see here is Lilith's house. So that's page 1. So it looks really similar to the thumbnail. But as you can see, it's much more polished, it's much more finished, it's grayscale shading. So it, you know, this one I really almost took directly, you know, the idea from my thumbnail and didn't change much in the final page. Here are the second and third pages. So you can see in the second page I did change some of the angle, but the basic elements are still there, like the house is there and the grave is still there. I also chose to change the graves from tombstones to like wooden crosses because of the time period. I don't think they would have had gravestones like that necessarily, especially in this small village where the story takes place. So that really, you know, tells you something about the plot. And then so here's Lilith. So I changed this slightly. You can see more of Lilith's waist than in the thumbnail, but it gives you that first impression of her as a character. She's kind of sad and she's by herself, and she's maybe contemplating something. So that really gives you, so page 2 gives you 1 and 2 give you a sense of setting, and page 3 gives you kind of a tone as well. You know, page 2 with the graveyard gives you a bit of a sense of the tone of the story, but page 3 then gives you even more of a sense of the tone. So let's go to the next page. So here is page 4. Another important thing to think about is how the dialogue bubbles are going to look on the page. So you can see the shape of my thumbnail is not the same shape as what I did in the final page. So that's another thing you kind of have to experiment with, what's going to look good, what's going to complement the rest of the illustration and not take away from it. And then we have the 5th page with the hand throwing the tomato. So that came out very similarly to the thumbnail. I did add in the background like this lighter gray and the darker gray to kind of enhance the movement of the tomato that much more. The next page you can see that I changed the way that Lilith is sitting. You don't see her legs as much, but you still have that action, the movement of the tomato being thrown at Lilith. So you get kind of the follow through of the previous page. And then I really like page 7 where it's just dialogue, because the rest of the pages have been so illustration heavy. So that kind of makes those words of abuse stand out. So I think you can tell from Pawn My Soul. Pawn My Soul is supposed to have a very fairy tale-like vibe to it, so I've simplified a lot of things in this. Everything from the script to the pages are very simple and telling kind of a straightforward story, even though there are layers to the theme and tone and of the story. It's not as simple as it might appear. It's more sophisticated when you delve deeper into the story, but on the surface it appears very simple because I wanted that storytelling feel, that fairy tale like feel. So we're gonna go on to Dr. Kame next, which will be a little bit more complex. Now let's talk about The Plague in Dr. Kame. So I've discussed previously that The Plague in Dr. Kame, every page has 4 panels. So that's really easy when you're thumbnailing because you don't have to think about how you're going to divide the page up. You just know immediately that the page is going to have 4 panels. But even so, and same with Pawn My Soul, even though you know every page is going to just be a single panel, you still have to consider how the pages are going to look next to each other and how the panels are going to look next to each other. So I'm very, as I said, I always look at the negative space, not just the positive space. So for instance, on this page of The Plague in Dr. Kame, I really like how this panel where he's grabbing his hat, it's not just about the subject, the positive space of his hand and the hat and the movement, but also about the background, the negative space that the subject creates. So this hand and hat are creating this interesting shape in the negative space. So I'm always thinking about that whenever I draw a panel. So it's, you have to place the characters very specifically. See, with this panel of Dr. Kame, he creates this interesting shape in the negative space as well. So I'm always thinking about that. I don't know if other comic book artists think about that as much as I do, but it's a really important part of when I'm planning out the thumbnails that are going to eventually be turned into final comic book pages. So here are just some examples of the finished pages of The Plague in Dr. Kame. As some of you may know, right now I'm crowdfunding this through a London-based publisher called Unbound. So if you have a moment, maybe you can check out Unbound's website and help us crowdfund if you have some extra dollars laying around, or maybe you can help us spread the word, because I've been working really hard to get this funded and I really want to get this published. So any little bit of help would be so appreciated. So we're gonna look at the script now for Dr. Kame. So here is the script. It's a little bit different, as you can see, than the script for Pawn My Soul, because with this script I knew that I was going to have 4 panels on every page, so I could do page 1 and then panel 1, 2, 3, 4, page 2, panel 1, 2, 3, 4. And this, as you can see, is pretty sparse as well. I'm kind of surprised looking back on my own work that I don't put more detail into my scripts, but I think it's because I do so much research visually and factually that there's a lot going, a lot more layers behind these very simple descriptions. Like when for instance, if you look, he collects dried roses and carnations, lemon balm and mint. I kind of have all of these reference photos of roses and carnations, etc. on my computer, so I look at those when I'm drawing them. And also these particular flowers and plants have come from research as to what the plague doctors would keep in their beaks. So even though it seems very simple on the page, there's a lot behind this, a lot of research behind this. So let me flip to, where is page 19? I think it's over here. Yes, so I'm going to show you page 19. So here we have page 19, panel 1, came with a slug in hand. Came says, hello, small friend. Panel 2, came, I'm very sorry. 3, came, but my leeches are hungry. 4, came, drops the slug into a jar of leeches. So these are very dark humor, dark comedy based, but also based in historical facts. So plague doctors would keep leeches for treating their patients, you know, putting leeches on their patient's body, and slugs are food for leeches. And Dr. Kame is kind of very fond of, through this you can see that Dr. Kame is fond of his leeches, but he's also fond of other animals, but he's not afraid to sacrifice the life of a slug to help the lives of his leeches. That tells you a lot about his character in just 4 panels, and I think that's the strength of this particular script, is that you learn a lot through every 4 panel page. You know, it's a little story on a little standalone story on each page, but the pages also, you know, obviously relate to one another, and there is an overarching story, but there is a little story on each page. So technically there are 100 pages, so technically there are 100 little stories in The Plague and Dr. Kame. So let's look at the thumbnail for page 19. So here's my thumbnail for page 19. You can see I have this really big close-up of the slug, and Dr. Kame's going to be saying, hello, small friends, in this. In Dr. Kame, it's a little bit different from my other comics because I don't really have dialogue bubbles, because I want it to have that medieval illuminated manuscript vibe to it. So I put all of the dialogue and all of the words at the top of each page. So that's why there are these lines here, because I'm kind of trying to make room for the words, but have also this room for the image. So here's the slug. Here's Dr. Kame. He's going to say, I'm very sorry. So he's holding the slug in his hand. So you kind of see like the slug up close, and then the slug in comparison to Dr. Kame's size. And then you see it even zooms in further where you get to see Dr. Kame's beak and the slug on Dr. Kame's hands. So he's going to be saying, but my leeches are hungry. And then you see the final panel is the jar of leeches, and Dr. Kame's going to drop that slug into the leeches. So this is, as you see, a very, very rough draft. I didn't take more than probably, as I said, 5 minutes to draw something like this, maybe 10 minutes. And then I also did this drawing below, so I had a reference for a slug, because it's kind of difficult to think of what a slug looks like from just my brain. So I wanted to make sure the slug looked like a slug, and I got a reference photo, and then I drew this so I would have an even better idea of how I'm going to draw the slug in the final comic. So let's go to another page. So let's look at page 20. So panel 1 talks about patient 3. Throughout this whole script, I don't give names necessarily to the different patients. So I have to say patient 1, patient 2, patient 3. And sometimes some of the patients come back depending on the story. So patient 3 came, says, tell me where it hurts. So in this panel, you can see it's going to have patient 3 and Dr. Kame. So in my thumbnail, I have the two of them talking to each other, standing next to each other. And then patient 3 says, my stomach, my back. So the next panel has the patient kind of gesturing to his stomach and back. And then Kame is by himself in the third panel. Too much yellow bile, I think. And patient 3 says, you think? So this is kind of like Dr. Kame isn't sure, and the patient's like, you're a doctor, how do you not know? Why are you not sure about this? So this is a pretty simple page, but it's going to look really cool when it's finished because it also has color to it. I think the color added a lot to the pages of Dr. Kame because at first they were not in color. And then for this thumbnail, I just have the face of the patient so I have to do a lot of different character designs because there are so many different patients, and I want to make sure that all of the patients are visually different, that they're different ages and genders and ethnicities, etc. So this guy is probably more wealthy. He has like this ruff going on. And so, yeah, so I have this as a note as a very quick character design for what he's going to look like in the final pages. So page 21 continues patient 3's story. So it starts with patient 3, Kame says, let us try the leeches. Panel 2, Kame starts putting leeches on patient 3. 3, Kame, nothing to fear. 4, patient 3 with leeches all over his body. So of course in this panel he's going to be like terrified because he has leeches all over his body. So here is the thumbnail, so you can see let us try the leeches is going to have Dr. Kame's hands with the bottle of leeches. And then I think the really important thing about this page is the contrast between the second panel and the last panel, because it's very similar with patient 3, but the second panel he's going to have just a couple of leeches, and then the last panel, and maybe he's calm or not too worried about having a couple leeches, but then this panel, the last panel, he's going to be just covered in leeches and maybe a little bit afraid because, see, Dr. Kame says nothing to fear, so he's clearly reacting to his patient being scared out of his mind. So as you can see, these are really, really simple sketches, and they don't have to be, you know, works of art. These are just to help you plan out your pages before you start drawing the final pages. So it's just a map, a guide that you create to when you're confronted with that blank page that you're going to start drawing your final comic book page. Instead of fearing the blank page, you're going to be like, oh, I know exactly what's going to go on this page because I already have a thumbnail where I worked out what was going there. Okay, so next we're going to look at the more complex, The Poet and the Flea. So here we have part of the script for volume 1 of The Poet and the Flea. So I'm going to go through some of this. This is a much more complex script and thumbnails than the other 2 graphic novels I've shown you, because this has many different panels on each page, and it's not a, you know, simple 4 panels on each page. Like none of the panels look the same from page to page. Each page has a unique set of panels. So I'm going to start with this part of the script. So I just have William serves tea. So this is William Blake, of course. So William serves tea. William, the ghost of a flea, you say? The Black Death and the Rat King. So that's simply what's going to go on the page. The flea spawns from the souls of brutal men. I feed on mortal blood. I am the Black Death, born on the back of the Rat King. I leave nothing but corpses in my wake. Medieval men fighting with swords. So this is across 2 pages. So here are my thumbnails. So you can see here's page 41. So William serves tea has kind of turned into 2 panels. So I have the kettle of boiling the kettle over the fire, and then 2 teacups, and then I have this panel of the flea sitting. So I can tell this is the flea. It might be confusing for someone just looking at this going like, what is this supposed to be? But I can tell that this is the flea. And then this is William's hand, Blake's hand holding the tea kettle, and he says, Ghost of a Flea, you say? So this is just this section right here. So just these two lines became this one page. And then here we have the Black Death and the Rat King. So this was an idea showing the flea not as his normal muscly self, but as an actual flea. So it's like the Ghost of the Flea's head, his face, but on the body of a flea, and he's riding a rat because, you know, that's, you know, been recorded that that's how the bubonic plague spread, was through fleas on rats. And then here in the middle is this whole kind of dialogue from the flea explaining his origins. And then I just had swords and spears here. So medieval men with swords. So this, I wasn't exactly sure how this was going to turn out in the final one, but I at least had a note as to what was going to go there. And then these are the final pages. So I don't know if you can tell. Let's try to pull this up here. So this page 41 became this, and then page 42 became this. So even though I just had these little like swords here, it said medieval men with swords, so it turned into this where it's this guy on a horse with like arrows trying to kill him. And this became a very detailed panel. So you can see how the panels in The Poet and the Flea on the final pages are much more detailed than my other work. It's much more detailed than Pawn My Soul, and it's much more detailed than The Plague and Dr. Came in a way. There's a lot of like little details with the, you know, spots, scales on the Ghost of a Flea, and lots of shading going on. So here's another page. This is the next page. So you can see how this is page 43. Let's zoom in here for a moment. So you can see that I have these skeletons here. It says Dance Macabre. So that became these skeletons here. And you have the flea over here with his hands, a very crudely drawn hands. But then you can see here that that was my note, to have him using his hands while he's talking. So these are kind of some complex compositions of the illustrations, but in relatively simple panels. But then the next page, you have these very dynamic panels where the different angles of the panels are making the tension greater. It's making the movement greater. So the flea kind of reaches out to Blake and touches him, and that scares Blake, and he loses his grip on his cup, and the cup falls and cracks on the ground. So here is the thumbnail for that. Let me zoom in. So as you can see, it's just like a really rough sketch of Blake's face, and you can see the flea's arm coming out, and William holding the teacup, drops the teacup, crack, shatters the teacup. So it's, you know, these are really, really quick, you know, drawings, but it's giving me an idea, writing down what I want to appear on each page, and then I have time I won't forget what I want on each page because I have it written down like this, but it's going to take time to draw something like this, like the final page. So this is kind of a way to not forget what you're going to put on the page, to give you enough time to draw the finished page. So let's look at another example. So here where it says the teacup shatters on the floor, that was the last page I showed you. And then the flea says, "You cannot fool me, poet, you shake with fright. William, my bones indeed tremble." The flea, heh. So these three lines here became one single page. So let's look at the thumbnail version, which is page 45. So it's right here. And so here you see "You Cannot Fool Me," and you see the flea's scary eyes, and you see Blake say about his bones trembling, and then the flea goes heh. So this is a very kind of simple 3-panel page, but it has some interesting things going on, like the top panel, there's like this angle to it, and it's really, you know, emphasizing the flea's eyes, which are quite scary. So here is the final page, the final version of this page. So you can see here the flea's eyes look really, really scary. And he's still grabbing Blake, so that, you know, you can see that Blake is disturbed and the flea is amused by disturbing Blake. So you can see that, you know, it's these two characters interacting. Again, you kind of get this interesting negative space created by the subject of the illustration, and you also, the dialogue bubbles are leading your eye across the page. So you're going to go, "You cannot fool me, poet, you shake with fright, my bones indeed tremble," and then your eye's going to jump to heh. So you're going to see these, but also you're being led, so "You cannot fool me," and you see the flea's face, and then you're going back to this bubble looking at Blake and then looking at the flea and heh. So there is definitely a flow going on that was originally worked out in the thumbnail. So I feel like we've covered a lot in this episode, but I also feel like this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to get through. I just wanted to give you guys examples of how I take my script and break it down into thumbnails. But there's so much more to learn about thumbnailing, how to put panels, you know, divide your page up into panels. It's totally great if you want to have equal sized panels, like how I do the Plague and Dr. Kame. It's always 4 equal sized panels on each page. That's one way to do it. It's also totally acceptable to do very different panels on each page, like the poet and the flea. No 2 pages look at all the same as far as panels go. So you just have to find the style that you like. Perhaps it's easier to start out with even panels when you're first starting comics, but definitely experiment with your panels. Experiment with how you place the dialogue in those panels, because the dialogue really affects the pacing, I think. And just the amount of panels on each page affects the pacing. If you're going to have like 1 or 2 panels on a page as opposed to like 10 panels on a page, the 2 panels are going to seem really slow and 10 panels are going to seem really, really fast. So definitely play around with that. So I hope that these 3 past episodes have been helpful to Joanna. I know that they're tackling a very big and complex project, so these 3 videos were kind of an introduction to these different elements of creating your own comic book, and I hope that Joanna and all of you will be able to pick and choose what's helpful to you within what I've covered here. But please ask me your questions. I'd be more than happy to answer them in an upcoming episode. So just comment below if you would like me to answer your question in a future video, or tweet me your question at GEGallas, which is GEGALLAS. If you want to subscribe to my channel, it's free. It's one easy click away and you'll get notified every time I post a new video, which is Tuesdays and Thursdays. And by subscribing, you'll help support this channel and help me make new episodes. So please don't forget to subscribe. Okay, that's all. See you next time.